Good afternoon, good morning to all. My name is Himayu Shotani, the head of international policy for Conflict Armaments Research. And it is a true pleasure for me to welcome all of you to today's event, which is organized in cooperation with the government of Japan, titled Upstream IED Prevention, Preventing the Proliferation and Diversion of Material that can be used to manufacture improvised explosive devices, IEDs. It is a true pleasure to convene this side event in the margins of the CCW Amended Protocol 2, which is happening today under the presidency of the government of Japan, and specifically under the presidency of Ambassador Ogasawara, who is here with us today to provide us with welcoming remarks. Thank you so much, Excellency, for being here. Before handing the floor to welcome remarks from the ambassador, please allow me to take this opportunity at the outset to express our sincere appreciation to the panelists that have joined us today. We have speakers from the Republic of Ghana, Interpol, RIETI, as well as our own head of Enhanced Investigation Unit, Mike Lewis. It is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us for this event. I would also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the support from the government of Japan, in addition to the European Commission and the government of Germany that has facilitated our work on issues pertaining to improvised explosive devices, and in particular, government of Japan for allowing us to convene this event here today. In this regard, just to set the scene, colleagues, we have gathered here today because we want to focus on one particular objective, which is enhancing knowledge and facilitating dialogue on ways to strengthen efforts to prevent and deter the acquisition, production, and deployment of IEDs in an upstream preventative manner. In this regard, we will focus particularly today on the importance of preventative tools, including tracing and monitoring of materials that can be diverted upstream to produce these items itself. In other words, to prevent these manufacturing in the first place. This will be a key theme that we will follow in this event. And in this regard, this event seeks to promote knowledge on some of the good practices that entities have taken to prevent the acquisition of these materials and to prevent the diversion of these materials for the production of IEDs by illicit actors, and to also share experience about a whole of community approach. And this, I'm sure our panelists will reflect further in this event. I also want to acknowledge at this outset that, of course, the IED problem is a global one, which is being addressed in multiple forums in addition to the CCW that was mentioned, including in the General Assembly, as well as in the Security Council, in particular relating to Resolution 2370 on preventing terrorists from acquiring weapons. With this very brief introduction, colleagues, I would like to note that this event is, of course, public and open, and that event is being recorded for record-keeping purposes and further use by Conflict Armaments Research. And now it is my honor to introduce to you the welcoming remarks by His Excellency, Ambassador Ogasawara. Ambassador Ogasawara is the permanent representative of Japan to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. He is also currently the president of the 2021 annual conference on CCW of APII taking place today. Ambassador Ogasawara has long experience in the arms control and the disarmament community, also having previously served as the Deputy Director General of Disarmament, Non-Proliferation and Science Department for the government of Japan. So without further ado, Ambassador, please allow me to provide you the floor for your opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. It is a great pleasure to participate in this very important and timely event. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this side event jointly organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan and Conflict Armament Research on the occasion of the 2021 annual conference of the CCW Amended Protocol 2. Actually, I'm chairing. This event is of the particular relevance to the activities to be conducted by the high contracted parties within the framework of the Amended Protocol 2. The exact theme of the diversion of these materials or the components to the IED is one of the hot issues which the high contracting parties have been discussed in the morning session, which I have just finished. So IEDs, improvised explosive devices, represent one of the primary weapons of choice of illegal armed groups, terrorists, and other illicit actors. The use of IEDs has affected over 50 countries and has resulted in thousands of casualties, both civilians and militaries. A wide spectrum of materials can be used in the manufacture of IEDs, including military and civilian commercial products, which pose a challenge to the ability of states to effectively regulate and control their proliferation and use. The international community continues to address the threat of IEDs under various forms, including the United Nations General Assembly, the UN Security Council, and the meetings of the high contracted parties to Amended Protocol 2 to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. However, owing to the evolving nature of material acquisition, IED production, as well as their means of delivery by illicit actors, great challenges remain for states to effectively prevent and deter IED proliferation and use. Challenges have been observed in the accurate identification of IED materials in various stages of material life cycle, maintaining comprehensive and accessible records, as well as information sharing and coordination between different national and international stakeholders involved in tracing operations. Further, unique challenges have been observed in conflict-affected settings where there may be lack of dedicated capacity and resources. In addition, emerging technologies and their applicability have represented both challenges and opportunities for countering the threat of IEDs. In this regard, at the current annual conference of the CCW AP2, which I'm chairing today, the high contract parties are considering the updated IED declarations to be submitted, if adopted, to the 6th Review Conference of High Contracting Parties to the CCW, which will take place next week, with the aim of raising collective commitments to address the threat of IEDs. We are very pleased to be working with Conflict Armament Research, an organization that supports states' efforts to identify and document materials that have been used to manufacture IEDs through field investigations in conflict-affected states settings, and to help trace their sources and identify supply networks. The work of conflict armament research extends beyond field research to supporting states affected by conflict in building capacities to develop sustainable national identification, documentation, and tracing capacity, as well as providing tailored advisory support to national export control authorities and arms control policy makers in order to bolster risk assessment pertaining to illicit flows of materials that can be used to fabricate IEDs. Excellencies, we have gathered here together today because we recognize the value of the effective implementation of the CCW AP2 and other relevant multilateral frameworks that pertaining to addressing to the threat of IED. We seek to work jointly with states, international organizations, and regional organizations civil society, and private sector actors to identify the pathway forward for strengthening preventing efforts against IEDs. Today's side event serves as an excellent platform for this objective. To this end, I wish to thank Conflict Armament Research once again, and all the panelists for their cooperation and support in convening this event. And I hope that today's discussion contributes to achieving concrete progress in this area. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency, Ambassador Ogasawara, for your remarks, as well as your support to Conflict Armaments Research in co-organizing this event. I took note, Ambassador, of the importance and the challenge pertaining to the wide spectrum of materials, including dual-use materials that can be used to manufacture IEDs. This indeed is a great challenge for us, and our panelists today will reflect further on how to strengthen preventative measures in this regard. I also want to thank you for drawing attention for the importance of tracing in informing loop back to preventative strategies and measures. This is something that certainly my colleague Mike Lewis will certainly talk quite a bit in detail about. And lastly, thank you also for drawing attention to the uniqueness of different contexts in which IEDs are used, including challenges faced by capacity issues or situations of armed conflict. This is very much appreciated, and we take this as a driver forward in terms of the dialogue that we'll have today. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your time. At this time, colleagues, I would like to now switch over to our panel discussions. And I would like to first start by introducing my colleague, Mike Lewis, who is the head of Enhanced Investigation Unit at Conflict Armaments Research. Mike Lewis is a former UN sanctions investigator and has documented weapons and IED components in over a dozen countries, including Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Iraq, South Sudan, Somalia, as well as Sudan. Mike, it is a true pleasure to have you here. And the floor is over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Himayo, and thank you to the Ambassador and the government of Japan for their support for this initiative, and much more importantly, for the work that they are pushing forward in the CCW as we speak. I don't want to speak for too long because I want to make sure that there are enough time for questions and discussion. But as a brief introduction, as my colleague said, I'm responsible for what we call our enhanced investigations within conflict armament research. What that means is that I and my team sit between our field teams, which document material, whether that's weapons, IED components, other relevant material in conflict zones, and between also our technical weapons and IED specialists who have, I think collectively between them over 90 or 100 years of experience of dealing with and technical analysis of these kinds of devices. And my team's work is, if you like, the upstream prevention part of our work on IEDs. That's to say, trying to establish long-range transnational supply chains for IED materials, components, and subcomponents, establishing how they arrive in theatre, but more importantly also the human, the financial, and the logistics networks that get them there. If I might just share my screen, then I think perhaps I can display a couple of slides, I think. 1 second. I hope that's visible, if
yes,
that's
Mike,
okay.
Thank you.
Can that be seen, Himo?
Yes, I confirm. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So just as I mentioned very briefly, our organization's work in this area is rooted in the direct documentation of IED components, subcomponents, and also materials like commercial explosives and explosive precursor chemicals that are used to make IEDs. Our approach is, in some ways, kind of startlingly naive. That's to say, we send teams who work embedded with defense and security forces in a number of theaters. They work alongside those teams and those governments to identify and document weapons, components, materials of all kinds. And the counterpart to that work is that we aim to provide both governments and industry, that's to say manufacturers and distributors of these kinds of products, with verified patterns of evidence of illicit production and procurement. That's to say, we can, because our own teams have done this work physically in the field, we can be very confident about the chain of custody of our evidence, the nature of our evidence continuity. And I'll talk about some of those challenges and practices a little bit in a few minutes. Before I do so, this is just a map to show, actually this is a map of all of our observations over the last few years, both of weapons and of IED components and subcomponents. But in terms of the geography of our work, as I mentioned, we focus particularly on devices used in conflicts. Of course, that's not the totality of the IED problem, but it is the one that we are particularly focused upon. And over the last few years, we've documented and traced IED materials in Afghanistan, in Bahrain, in Burkina Faso, in Iraq, Mali, Niger, Syria, Yemen, and a number of other places. Some of that work has been supported, I should add, by the European Commission, who has established a project in 2018 called iTrace Plus, which works both inside and outside the Union to understand the patterns moving these materials around. And in contrast, you know, that feeds into the European agenda on security. What do we do with all this data once we've gathered it? So we maintain a number of data systems to systematically record everything from IED components through to precursor chemicals, which you can see here on the screen. This is a screenshot from one of our databases. We record in great detail the nature of the items, as much as we can about their provenance, as much as we can about their routes of supply, following tracing and other investigation. And this enables, we hope, both governments and industry to spot patterns in supply and proliferation of these kinds of items. And so to some degree, what we aim to do is to try to provide some of the sort of evidence base for the policy making that is happening now increasingly at the CCW and elsewhere. And then on top of that, as I said, we also do conduct, in some cases, our own network investigations into the networks that are supplying these items. This, as you can see on the screen, is an example of a procurement network that the Islamic State used in Iraq and Syria to procure both precursors for homemade explosives and also a range of devices for improvised weapons of all kinds. So what does the documentation look like on the ground? And what are the challenges and the considerations we face when we, and others of course, are doing this kind of work? There are both practical and evidential challenges. The first and most obvious practical consideration is that the identification and the tracing of IED components and materials is only one part of the much larger array of objectives that exist when IEDs are being documented and exploited. Of course, there are military, there are law enforcement, and there are humanitarian objectives in that kind of documentation and exploitation. Everything from trying to establish how devices work and how they are deployed, through to trying to identify the individual human beings who are creating them. And even within the sphere of attack the network work, even within the sphere of trying to understand the wider networks that are leading to the creation, the manufacture, and the deployment of these devices, tracing components is only one element. There will also be interest from law enforcement in obtaining biodata and other forensic information. There will be people who will be doing human network analysis of the constructors of these devices, and so on and so on. I know the room is filled with IED specialists, so I won't try to enumerate the exploitation cycle, but you will be all aware, and we are very conscious that there are other objectives at play in documenting an IED or its components, and we have to be very mindful of those other objectives, some of which, frankly, are sometimes more urgent or more time critical than ours, particularly, of course, in the military and the humanitarian context. And of course, then, on top of that, there are safety and security considerations when we and others are exploiting these devices. One of the things that we hope that we can bring within a conflict context is that we are able to, because some of our objectives are not quite as time critical as others, we are able to ensure the chain of custody of evidence and the integrity of that evidence in ways that is sometimes simply impossible in other contexts within a conflict zone. That's something I think we're getting better at, and that's something that we are getting better at working particularly with law enforcement partners about in various different contexts. But that's a critical consideration, and all of that work relies, of course, upon collaboration with partners, both national and intergovernmental. So whether it's a national government or a law enforcement agency, or whether it's a UN or an AU or another intergovernmental mission, these are key. Establishing that kind of dialogue and collaboration is absolutely critical for us. I'm delighted that Leo Tettey from one of our key partners in West Africa, the Ghana National Commission, is here and will be able to talk a bit more about the way that his government's work is complementing the work that we are doing in West Africa. And then just finally, I don't want to speak much longer, but there are, of course, very pressing evidential challenges that derive from the nature of the items that we are talking about, which are not, of course, conventional weapons that the CCW and other fora are used to dealing with. They are generally, often items that are not marked and produced with lot and serial numbers, for example, and which makes their tracing quite complicated. In many cases, record keeping by not only manufacturers but also distributors of these products is not as rigorous as you would expect with commercial, with conventional weapons. That's to say, the records of who buys which lots and batches or serial numbers of items is not established in the way that it would be with, or you would expect that it would be with a small arm, for example. There is, currently quite a kind of patchwork of standards and regulations about how both marking and record keeping of key IED components and materials takes place. The EU has set standards for commercial explosives, for example, that are now being, moved in other contexts. But when people are talking about upstream prevention, some of that basic standard setting work about the traceability and the identifiability of these kinds of items, is a core part of this puzzle. One of the other things that we increasingly see in our own work is that actors who produce IEDs are increasingly trying to conceal the origins of components and subcomponents in a way that is familiar to us from our work on conventional weapons, the obliteration of serial numbers on assault rifles, for example. We're seeing increasingly the same thing with producers of IEDs, probably because they are conscious that many more people are looking to do upstream supply chain tracing of this kind. So this is, as you see on the screen, a number of instances, some successful, some less successful, at painting over or scratching off markings, particularly on semiconductors, but also, as you see on the left, sometimes whole systems. And that impedes the next stage of our work, which is the tracing process. Unlike firearms or weapons, generally we can't use the kinds of intergovernmental channels for tracing that have existed for some time, with the International Tracing Instrument for Firearms, for example. So this process is much more reliant on engagement and collaboration with commercial actors, with producers and manufacturers of explosives, semiconductors, electronic components, and so on. And that active engagement and collaboration, again, is something that I think is a critical piece of this puzzle that is going to happen a lot more, and the sensitization of those commercial actors is going to happen a lot more as this area expands. So this is, as you can see on the slide, is an example of a tracing request that we might send to a commercial actor, in this case, the manufacturer of a set of detonators. And quite often we are surprised by the level and the depth of collaboration that we have with, that we enjoy with some of these commercial actors. This is an example of the tracing results of a large number of bags of a particular explosive, homemade explosive precursor material that we documented right across the Middle East, and the tracing work, the formal tracing work with the manufacturer of these items enabled us to identify the entire network that you saw previously on the previous slide. And then just to conclude, because I know, Chair, that I have spoken for a little bit too long, but just to conclude some of the kinds of payoffs of some of this work, and why I think cross-border collaboration in this area is so critical. This is an example of an investigation that my unit undertook a couple of years ago. These are detonators, electric and non-electric detonators, recovered from both from IED production facilities and from IEDs themselves. Over 50% of all the detonators and the detonating cord that our teams identified, for example, in Iraq and Syria, deployed by the Islamic State since 2014, have come from a single shipment of detonators and det cord that came into a neighboring country in 2013. And this is an example of the kinds of results that you can get from attentiveness and serious tracing across a whole sequence of IED events, that you can identify these choke points, key transactions or key intermediaries that are responsible for, or not necessarily responsible for, but central to the supply chains of IED events and production right across a huge area. So on this map here, you see some of the places where we documented these detonators and det cords across both Syria and Iraq that came in from this individual shipment. And then just to conclude, one of the things that our investigation was able to show was that there were a whole sequence of commercial actors involved in importing these materials that were not visible to the government that authorized the importation. And that's not for any nefarious reason. It's simply because a particular entity was licensed to import this material, but actually the customer, the final purchaser of these items, never appeared on the import license. They were using the license of somebody else, not illegitimately. It was only when we were able to obtain the shipping documentation that you can see here for this shipment that we saw these other commercial actors. And then with dialogue with other governments in the region, we were able to establish that one of these commercial actors has actually been linked to terrorist attacks, IED attacks, at least 2 of them in neighboring countries. So not related to Islamic State, not related to conflict, but that's the kind of information that is not shared across border, because the investigators in that country will not have seen the IED data from Iraq and Syria. They won't have seen the supply chain information from the neighboring country. And so, my final kind of point, I suppose, is to say that the kinds of transnational work that is increasingly being done by our organization and others, and the information sharing that is happening in places like West Africa that Mr. Tettey is going to talk about, that is the third critical piece, alongside record keeping, tracing, and documentation. That kind of cross-border information sharing is the critical piece that is going to make upstream prevention work properly. Apologies for my prolix remarks, and that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. First and foremost, for elaborating on the unique nature of the work of conflict armaments research and how you conduct field investigation, as well as how you conduct tracing, and followed by some of the enhanced investigation that you lead in the team. Thank you so much. In terms of the substance, I took away a few points. First, the uniqueness or the importance of identification and accurate identification and challenges associated to identification of some of these materials that are sometimes more difficult than conventional weaponry due to its nature. Second, the variation in practices of record keeping with these materials was also noted as a prerequisite need to be able to trace. And in this regard, you noted on the concealment techniques that you're increasingly observing, including through obliterations of serial numbers as a key factor to keep in mind. And of course, when it comes to tracing, thank you for highlighting the importance of working with commercial actors, including distributors, other intermediaries, but also manufacturers, and the successes you've had so far in unpacking that. And finally, the cooperation that will allow the organization like Armament Research to identify choke points of large shipments that are then made available to illicit actors for the production of IEDs, and in turn, informing red flags for national authorities to monitor and identify these suspicious activities. Thank you so much, Mike, for this elaboration. And with this, I would like to now turn to my next speaker, Leonard. Tettey, Leonard, very much welcome to this webinar. Leonard is a national small arms and light weapons project coordinator from the Republic of Ghana. Most recently, he served as a senior program officer with the Ghana National Commission on Small Arms and Light Weapons. And under this role, he served as a schedule officer and a policy advisor for various multilateral processes, including the Arms Trade Treaty, Convention of Cluster Munitions, Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, UN Program of Action, and the International Tracing Instrument, as well as, of course, the ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons. Leo, it is always a pleasure to be able to engage with you. I'd like to hand over to you while I project the slide from my side. Over to you, Leo. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Himayu and colleagues, excellencies and colleagues. You welcome to this meeting, this webinar. For us as Ghana, it's a privilege to be part of this, to share our national experience with a wider group of persons on our experiences when it comes to IED and counter-IED materials and its proliferation within the sub-region or within the national context. I'll go to the next slide because of time. And Imayu, please try to alert me, because I like talking a lot. So kindly alert me when my time is almost up. Otherwise, I'll end up stealing all the time. So someone who has Ghana experienced any IED-related incidents, the answer is yes. Even though we have not experienced any form of detonation or blast, we've had quite a number of experiences when it comes to issues of IED. So we have had a few related issues. So the first incident was an incident that happened somewhere in Kumasi, the middle belt of the country, where our National Explosive Ordnance Disposal Team from the Ghana Armed Forces were able to defuse some IED. The setup included 2 explosive boosters, a remote control, a timer device, a detonator and safety fuses, and then 2 7.5 kilogram LPG gas filled with dynamite. And it's worth noting that one of the cylinders had a detonator and the dynamite, which would have exploded within minutes if the team had not been in place. The second incident was 3 persons who were arrested somewhere. Obviously, these suburbs are very local suburbs. We call the place Baaleshi Dodoa. Some items were seized from them. The items that were seized from them included machines and materials, which the suspicion was that they were going to use to construct or IED, some 3 smoked grenades, some already constructed IEDs, 22 in number. We also got some AK-47 magazines. Obviously, these things always move along with the small arms and light weapons. So we also see some 5 locally made pistols, magazines, a long rifle, a gunpowder, which has been stuffed in the metal casing, metal fillings made from heavy, and then powdered pepper, and also some chemicals that were actually sealed in syringes. These matters are still before the courts, and very soon it's likely the courts will rule on them. But the preliminary findings are that these are actually IEDs. Our third incident happened in a suburb called Odoko, where 3 men were arrested with military grenades. The suspicion was that these grenades were going to be used upon interrogation, were going to be used to, produce or construct IEDs. The next slide. Now, for us, apart from these the reported incidents of IEDs, not full explosion though, the issue of commercial explosives or explosive meant for civilian use or mining use has always been the issue on the radar. This is because there's an easy accessibility and availability of commercial explosives, which are obviously relatively easy to obtain in Ghana. This is largely influenced by the increasing importation and the usage. Obviously, we can also confirm that we've had a series of tracing requests, which we have cooperated with the Conflict Armament Research on some items that have been, or IED related issues that have been found in other regions or other parts, especially in Burkina Faso and Mali. And the items that have been involved are actually commercial explosives, and which these explosives have been traced back to Ghana, or the companies that were who are dealt in these explosives were actually Ghanaian companies. We have cooperated and provided some information to CAR in that regard. But apart from that, this frequent issues of tracing commercial explosives that has been used in the manufacture of IEDs to Ghana has gotten the attention of the state, of the national security and the security architecture. And because of that, a number of interventions have been put in place to avert the continuous leakage or diversion of commercial explosives from Ghana. Next slide. So this is just to provide you an overview. After some assessment that we conducted together with the Small Arms Survey on the nature and the extent at which commercial explosives get diverted from the sub-region or within the sub-region. So for us, the conclusion that we have drawn is that apart from these reported incidents that we have, the most likelihood mode of construction of IEDs in Ghana and within the sub-region will be through commercial explosives, i.e. mining explosives. We have done some assessment on the trends in terms of imports. Apart from the import, the differentials that we get in terms of what is imported and what is not accounted for. Some of the figures are a bit mind-boggling. We felt that these are the main areas that we could have possible IEDs being manufactured. The next slide, please. Another area that we found very disturbing or alarming is the issue of ammonia nitrate. For instance, in Ghana, we've had considerable amount of ammonium nitrate being imported into the country. We've seen an astronomical increase in these importations. And obviously, we have seen quite some disturbing trends where most of these ammonia nitrates cannot be accounted for, and we see them being diverted into the illicit market. Obviously, our initial assessment also shows that some of these, and then we have also seen certain trends, alarming trends as well. We've seen the illicit manufacturing of commercial explosives. Apologies for any national. We have put some pictures out there for you to see how these commercial explosives are actually being illicitly being manufactured in Ghana. And I mean, these are illicit manufacturing activities. They are escaping the radar of the control system. And obviously, I mean, these are things that, I mean, end up virtually will possibly end up in the hands of the wrong persons. Over the years, we have intercepted a number of explosives, commercial explosives, being taken out of the country. This is the first one that was intercepted some time back. The next slide. This is another bundles of Maxam Riding, which was intercepted on our border town by our customs division. The next slide. And just recently, these explosive that was acquired from the black market in Ghana. It was an initiative that I conducted with my team here in the office, and to see how easy it is to procure commercial explosives in the black market. And we're surprised at the ease and accessibility that it comes with just procuring commercial explosives in the black market. It was that easy. Now, if you look at how these commercial explosives are being trafficked, so we see a lot of importation in excess of what the country needs. And this is the main source of leakage. So all these commercial explosives come in illicitly, I mean, for commercial purposes, in large quantities, obviously more than what the country actually needs. And these are actually done by major importers. These importers then sell it out to dealers, to mining companies, to quarry companies, and to others. And this is where the illicit activities then begin. If you can go to the previous slide. So from the importers to the dealers, this is where it now enters the illicit markets. And then the distribution then goes on. Some inland, it gets to the small scale miners, to galamsey sites, to illegal quarry sites. And a number of them ends up out of the country because the demand in the country is not that high compared to the amount that actually is imported into the country. And we see from our various assessments that we have done that these commercial explosives are leaving the country to other parts of the country, to Burkina Faso, to Cote d'Ivoire, Mali. And that explains why we keep having tracing requests from the Conflict Armament Research on items that have been found to have been used in constructing IEDs that are of Ghanaian origin. Now, this is how, from the various assessments that we have done, these are how usually the explosives or commercial explosives are transported or are leaked into the illicit market out of the country. So we have a very vibrant mining around Takwa area, around the Kenya Sea area, and all these areas are where these excess commercial explosives get to. And because they are excess, I mean, trying to find market for them within the country becomes almost impossible, and they end up leaving the country. What we have here are the main hotspots where these activities or illegal activities are taking place. This is what I want to share with the colleagues. The next slide, please. So what are some of the measures we are taking against this? I think in my previous submission, I stated that the issue of the leakage of military armament doesn't look likely within the sub-region because from all indications, the military stockpiles are well kept. The standards are very high, so it's very difficult to get any military armament being leaked into the illicit market to be used in manufacturing IEDs. But we have found that the main source that is likely, we are likely to get items being used to construct IEDs in the area of commercial explosives. So, I mean, we have conducted some baseline survey to see this, and this is most of the presentations that I've done is based on the baseline survey that we conducted to see where there is a likelihood of production of IEDs. Secondly, we have seen that there's a need for us to put stricter controls on commercial explosives. So we have included commercial explosives in our current draft national control list. And when this control list is passed into law, it's likely we will subject the issue of commercial explosive to the same standards as conventional arms and transfers. Now, we know that the Ministry of Interior has also begun some monitoring work, especially on storage sites across the country. They've also doing some monitoring on the practices, the transportation, as well as the use of explosives. Just recently, together with, in collaboration with the Small Arms Survey, we convened a national stakeholder consultation to deliberate on the proliferation of commercial explosives into the illicit market. So this is also something that we are tackling. In view of time, I'll move to the next slide. So what recommendations will we put across for colleagues? First of all, there's a need for countries to conduct some level of baseline service on IEDs and commercial explosives, especially. Countries will need to, or states will need to look at possible areas where the states are likely, or armament or items are likely to be diverted to be used in IEDs. It's important the state establishes that. So we are calling for or making a strong recommendation on the need for baseline service to be conducted. Now, when it comes to issues of IEDs, I think in my presentation, I've already listed that some of these items that left the country were actually found to have been used in constructing IEDs in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and all that. So it looks like the issue of IED is a regional problem, and we need a regional approach or harmonized approach to deal with it. If countries are adopting individual country-specific approaches, whilst you might be resolving issues in your country, you might be creating problems in other countries. So there's a need for a regional approach, a harmonized approach to deal with it. Obviously, the success of every, knowing the source of every IED item that are used in constructing IED is very critical. So there's a need for states to establish an effective system, standardize it to be able to trace items that have been used, have been found to have been used to construct IEDs. IEDs are becoming a new phenomenon. It's becoming a new norm now. I mean, terrorists are finding those IEDs a more suitable way to cause more havoc. So there's a need for some level of capacity training for our various security institutions in this regard. So we will recommend strongly the need for various agencies, actors, and stakeholders, the capacity of these institutions to be enhanced in this regard. So I think I've kept within my 15 minutes limits. I once again thank you for the opportunity, and I will stand by for any questions if there is. Thank you again, and Over.
Thank you very much, Leo. Very insightful, detailed presentation, I must say. Thank you so much. First of all, for sharing a little bit about the vulnerabilities that you have observed at the national level when it comes to excess importation of commercial explosives, whether in addition to counterfeit aspects that you have observed, as well as let's say diversion and proliferation through illicit markets. These were some of the key areas that you highlighted in your remarks in terms of vulnerabilities, but also thank you for then subsequently sharing with us the recommendations. And here I noted baseline assessments across the region, regional approach to make sure that there's coordination and information exchange, tracing of items that have been recovered, as well as training and capacity building moving ahead. These are very key elements of the work that you have noted on, and I thank you for that. Now, mindful of the time as well, let's move to the next speaker shortly, which it's a pleasure to welcome Maiko-san. Maiko-san, you are, of course, have 20 years of experience in non-proliferation and international security trade control in the United Nations, but as well in the government of Japan. Until 2021, you served as a member of the United Nations North Korean Sanction Monitoring Panel. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And when I invite you, I'd like to maybe take us a little bit back and reflect on a broader aspect or context of securing dual-use component transfers as it pertains to IEDs. As we heard from the Ghanaian colleague, as well as Mike Lewis, this area of dual-use items is really increasingly a challenge for many that are operating in the counter-IED space. So if I may, just invite you to talk about a little bit of what you observed as vulnerabilities, but also some good practice. I will now project your slide as you introduce. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shimayo-san. So yeah, I'll just wait for a moment too. So maybe, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Himayo. So hello again, everybody. My name's Maiko Takeuchi. So today I'll thank you for the Himayo for the question, because they are all very important aspects. And today I will talk based on my experience in the government and also United Nations about the control of dual-use items, particularly used for the IEDs. So it's a big challenge. So next slide, please. So today's outline is simple. So I'll first explain what's the dual-use items, first of all, and what's the challenge and what to do as all the stakeholders have to take, their part. So let's go to the next slide. So first of all, what are the IED dual-use components? So many of you are familiar to this type of items. The components include explosives, detonator cores, and vehicle battery alarm, or like cell phone. So these are they are also like a remote control devices as well as detonator. So they are, of course, sometimes they are used mounted on the card. But next slide, please. But now IEDs are not only the roadside bombs or like a car bombs, but also mounted on the boats. Waterborne improvised explosive devices is one of the serious concern now. It's like a left photo is an example of like the small boat mounted, like IEDs mounted on. And on the right is a kind of like a steering box of waterborne IEDs that's actually used and seized. Next slide, please. And also IEDs are used with their aerial unmanned vehicles, UAV drones. So then that case, the photo are like a UAV components also seized by another, saw by another UN monitoring panel. So that's such as UAV engines, actuator, that there's, that is control, like a device to control the position and power. But so now the target of IED control, the IED dual use items control are wider range of the items than the not only genuine IED components, but also the items used for UAVs or like these are also the components we have to watch. But this is another good news that because of that, the tracing the producer could have another clue, because these are not just explosives, they are not just a cell phone that you can do, you can buy. So that's another clue. These development in certain areas, say Yemen, could be another clue to trace these procurement of or the producer of these IEDs. So the next slide, please. So this is my main point. So what's the challenge? First of all, probably you are all aware of but most of items are dual use, and already discussed by Leonard. It can be procured by black markets, and also some IED builders are has highly sophisticated skills and knowledge. So if we shut down one item, then they will find a way to build another way. So that's always a challenge. And furthermore, there's not always controlled items that the government can actually legally control, although many countries would, I guess, have the so-called like a catch-all provision. So if they have information that these particular items could be used for surely for the IED, builders, then they would stop it based on this the legal, like a domestic legal framework. But by nature, dual use items are widely exported, hard to control, and also, already Mike pointed out the studies, but the obfuscate techniques are seen. So like traditionally, my good old days when I served as a trade control officer, serial number is always the key. And then now they're smart enough to try to alleviate the serial numbers. And then many places like where IEDs used are under like embargoes, or government is also try to control both the importer side and also exporter countries. And then still they procure using the complicated routes of using circumvention techniques, or third countries using paper companies. And also one of the fundamental limitation of current export control and international, like our efforts, are these voluntary cooperation can only address the like-minded countries. And then we have to find a way to always find it, go deep dive to approach or stop the person who is unaware of the risk, or even just ignoring the risk and try to build them. So so raising awareness is key to kind of tighten our control link, so that we can really kick out the people who is intentionally breaking the rules and building the IEDs. So what to do? Good practice. As Ambassador Ogasawara already mentioned in opening remarks, international efforts are still very vital, especially the swift information sharing, called like say whatever the diplomats call the dossier démarche, but so that to do this international like cooperation, then the governments have to exchange the view or establish the line in advance. And also, like Mike explained in the how to collaborate with the industry. Also another key, that's without like before it's happening, the governments and have to approach to the other counterparts, like-minded countries, and also private sectors. So government plays a lot of effort. And of course, international effort by other stakeholders, including civil society, is another key to raise overall awareness of the issue and promote the collaboration. I'm also now in the joining with one of the NGOs, but we really have to push the government to work on this issue. And then of course, Himayu-san, can you go back to the slide, please? It's like a slide was just kind of gone now, but let me continue to, yeah, great. Yes. So of course, in addition, so one of the key, it's like now black, but oh yeah. One more slide. Can you, one more slide, go ahead. Oh yes, perfect. So the government is a key, but also what we have to do essentially is a trade control. Then trade control, private sector is the key player on this. And then, so government must continuously approach to the industry as well as universities to raise awareness. Why? They are key, and also university student might in future go to the company, or university itself could be involved in the part of illicit procurement that's happening a lot. So, so if they know the risk of dual use items transfer, they could notice the red flag. And for the screening, the manufacturers should not rely on only the name screening, but also conduct customer due diligence based on the, we call it risk-based approaches are vital. So not only just screening the names of the customer is not enough. The private sector has to take more, one more step to really control their products. Just don't want to be, they don't want to be found their product in the conflict area in a photo, that's the last thing they want to do. So then to do that, the export control system is a key. And generally, in my experience, the higher risk in a failure of the internal screening by the company when the export was conducted by overseas branches. So sometimes headquarters have to oversee the transaction made by overseas branches. That's one of the tips that I learned from on my own experience. So let me conclude my presentation. So what I want to emphasize here is all stakeholders, governments, private sector, civil society, all the stakeholders can play a role on this issue. And many of you might have more a best practice, experience. So I'm ready for the discussion in the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maiko-san. First and foremost, for highlighting that when we talk about improvised explosive devices, it's not just for the materials that need to be monitored for the manufacturing, but also for the delivery systems, whether it may be by air, by sea, by land. Second, thank you also for highlighting the need to raise awareness with the, let's say, intermediaries, but also with the private sector and industry. In particular, you noted on the importance of awareness raising and outreach by government entities to industry and university, the importance of information exchange among government entities in order to cooperate in advance to enable information exchange on these materials. And then thirdly, and lastly, the importance of internal due diligence systems of industry actors to make sure that not only to screen the customer, but to understand the potential risks beyond the immediate customer for proliferation. Thank you so much for this, Maiko-san. I took that very clearly. And so with this, I would now like to invite our last speaker, who is, I'm very pleased to welcome very much, Daniel Goldstein. Daniel is amongst, let's say, several tasks, let's say, roles that he plays. He is a policy analyst for Interpol's CBRNE and Vulnerable Target Subdirectorate. since 2019. He has held Interpol's chairmanship for the United Nations Global Compact, Counter-Terrorism Coordination Global Compact Working Group on emerging threats and critical infrastructure protection. He has also previously held positions with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Daniel, it's a pleasure to have you. Let's hear a little bit from you now, having heard a host number of experiences from tracing ASCAR, national perspectives, the good practices around industry engagement on dual-use control items. Let's now hear a little bit from the law enforcement perspective in terms of cooperation. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much, Himayu. Just to confirm, can you hear me and see my slides? Great, thank you so much. First of all, thank you very much to the Government of Japan and Conflict Armament Research for inviting Interpol to present here. For those of you who are not familiar, Interpol is an international law enforcement cooperation organization with 195 member countries. At the base, we work to promote the widest possible mutual assistance between all criminal police authorities across those member countries. And importantly, our organization has a strong neutrality principle, meaning Interpol does not associate itself with the convention nor its amended protocols. In my remarks today, I want to give you an idea of what this big field of international law enforcement cooperation, what this looks like concretely from our perspective. Law enforcement overall is a broad category that means different things to different people, and it's a term I'll use frequently, but here I'm really referring to national criminal police authorities. And our criminal focus means that we at Interpol were dealing with non-state actors who by their very nature do not adhere to the CCW AP2. There are no thresholds established on the use of IEDs. There are no prohibitions. There's no limits here. We're literally up against a limitless set of highly capable and innovative criminals who share information across borders. They communicate with people around the world, and they divert goods from global supply chains. And I think that makes government action and high-level dialogue on upstream IED threat analysis all the more important. So let me move my slide. So first, when we think of an IED incident's plotline at a high level, at what stages is this idea of international law enforcement cooperation applicable? Well, in short, it's applicable throughout. And importantly, due to the international nature of supply lines, criminality, and terrorism today, in most incidents, there's likely to be some related activity abroad for which international police cooperation is necessary. Either there are suspects of nationals from another country, or the individuals in question, they obtained precursor chemicals from an international supply chain, or they obtained financial support from another country, or they're part of a transnational criminal or terrorist group. So police cooperation all starts with a tripwire being triggered nationally by some suspicious activity along this plot line you see here. This is followed by a need for support or information from another policing partner. And based on the stage, the type of law enforcement cooperation we engage in is going to vary. At the acquisition stage of criminals looking to obtain knowledge to safely construct an IED, they're looking for precursor chemicals, which can often involve a complex supply network. And here, law enforcement tripwires could be triggered by an individual ordering an abnormal quantity of chemicals or precursor components from abroad, for example. This would be the upstream bit that I think we're focusing on today. At the development and then that execution stages, once again, there are triggers here, there are tripwires, excuse me, for law enforcement. And in the unfortunate incident where an IED actually is detonated post-incident, there's scope for law enforcement cooperation during the investigation, for example, when analyzing the explosives used, identifying the transnational network involved, or conducting victim identification. So in short, law enforcement cooperation is a really wide-ranging subject, and it does not always involve Interpol. However, there are many cases in which we are involved. This cooperation largely takes place through Interpol notices, which are international requests for information, cooperation, or to warn of alerts. The most well-known is the red notice for someone wanted by a national jurisdiction, either for prosecution or to serve a sentence. For the IED threat, there are others here that I think are similarly valuable, including an orange notice, which warns of a serious and imminent threat to public safety, and a purple notice, which provides information on modus operandi used by criminals. And I thought it would be useful to talk through some real notices so that you have an idea of what we mean when we talk about international police cooperation on this threat. So the first one is an orange notice. Once again, that's warning of an imminent threat to public safety. This is from 2018, in which 400 kilograms of explosives and electronic detonators were stolen from a construction site. While 150 kilograms were actually recovered, the remaining amount was not found. So Interpol, with support from the requesting country, issued this orange notice, which includes a list of the stolen items, including product names, quantities, and tracking codes. As it's possible that the goods were removed outside the country in question, the notice served to kind of put countries on alert and to serve as a reminder to secure explosive stockpiles at construction and other sites. And of course, as we heard from the previous presenters, explosives indeed are throughout many countries for very legitimate purposes. Another orange notice from 2021 followed IED incidents targeting electrical pylons. Following technical exploitation by national police, these IEDs were found to use Arduino nanoboards for their time-delayed detonation system. These nanoboards are cheap, they're publicly available, and in most cases, they have entirely benign applications. But the orange notice here, it provided our membership with an additional piece of information which could support their undercover or investigative activities. The next example here is a purple notice, which instead of warning of an imminent threat to public safety, it warns of a modus operandi used by criminals, including terrorists. In this case, a terrorist organization had claimed responsibility for a series of high-level bombings. National police identified a safe house where a diverse set of chemicals and materials were found, including toluene, which is used to produce TNT. The notice was issued with the assessment that at least one individual involved had significant knowledge of homemade explosives production and IED construction, and had experimented with several homemade explosive recipes. Now for the red notices. At the end of 2020, there were around 66,000 valid red notices, the majority of which are available only to law enforcement, but there are around 7,500 that are shared publicly by Interpol's website, and they can be accessed by anybody here. The ones here are publicly available and have at least some involvement with the illicit possession, trafficking, or use of explosives. Now, the benefit of this type of notice is that an individual with a red notice associated with their name, passport number, or biometrics, they have difficulty moving across borders without detection. So many airports, border checkpoints, or visa processing facilities, they're linked to Interpol systems, and officials will be notified immediately if an individual with a red notice on them has been detected. The country which has requested the red notice will also be notified that this individual has been detected by another Interpol member country. So I've shown you some examples of what this cooperation looks like, but how does information from an incident in one country reach our global law enforcement community? What does information sharing actually look like? Well, either an IED detonates or a plot is uncovered, and then incident data is provided to Interpol at our request or on the initiative of the relevant country. Our interest could be for many reasons, such as the incident involves a suspect from another country, or it allegedly involves a well-known transnational terrorist network, or some other reason. Then we at Interpol, at the General Secretariat, we work with the country to select the appropriate notice. We assess its contents against our constitution and rules, and we add in relevant trends, precautionary measures, and recommendations. And then we publish. Depending on the type of notice, the information is then automatically entered into the appropriate Interpol database and analytical files. Immediately, 195 member countries, they receive the notice in the inbox of their national Interpol office, and then they likely forward it on to their counter-terrorism or counter-IED focal points. Now, that process is quite frankly, that's in a perfect world, where everybody in the midst of a terrorist incident, they remember to conduct voluntary reporting. But we found that sustained regional engagement, that results in more member countries reporting to Interpol on more explosive incidents on a regular basis. This results in more notices for our membership and a better informed global community, at least at the policing level. We achieved this in the explosive space through regional intelligence sharing working groups under an initiative known as Watchmaker, which is run by our Chemical and Explosives Terrorism Prevention Unit. These are standing forums that bring countries together to share information and intelligence on explosive threats that they are facing domestically. These forums allow our regional policing partners to share data with Interpol and learn immediately about new threats, ongoing investigations, and operations. It also offers an interactive space to request clarifications from other partners, perhaps identify links between other incidents, and generally cooperate at an expert level. And you'll see we have several ongoing Watchmaker forums at present, and with an expansion planned for 2022 into Southeast Asia. So mindful of the time, I'll conclude quite quickly by emphasizing that from our policing perspective, we cannot just work with other police officers to counter the IED threat. I think this is a theme made throughout the presentations today. In the course of our work, we engage with customs, military, industry, academia, policymakers, and of course the UN and international organizations. And importantly, I just want to highlight industry engagement is really vital for us. That acquisition stage I mentioned in the plot line earlier, that's the best spot for law enforcement detection, and industry's key here. They can tell us what is and what is not a normal quantity of a particular chemical for industrial use. They know what common packaging sizes are. They know what supply chain vulnerabilities look like. And they also have a general idea of what constitutes suspicious behavior, because they're dealing with customers in their community on a daily basis. As well, together with our American partners and in cooperation with the G7 Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Interpol runs a global congress on chemical security and emerging threats, which brings together a diverse community for the benefit of our law enforcement partners. And this Congress runs an industry advisory group, which has been really helpful when preparing some of the orange notices I mentioned earlier. And lastly, I'll mention that Interpol holds the chairpersonship of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact Working Group on Emerging Threats and Critical Infrastructure Protection. It is not the shortest title, but it certainly communicates the type of work that we carry out. And as chair, I help coordinate the efforts of 27 UN and non-UN entities on explosives, terrorism prevention, and other areas as well. And this too supports Interpol's situational awareness as we're able to link partners outside our mission space, including the World Customs Organization or the UN Office on Disarmament Affairs, which is one of our vice chairs. So I'll end there. And of course, thank you very much to our Japanese colleagues and Conflict Armament Research and Imayo in particular for organizing this event. And of course, happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Really fascinating presentation, I have to say. First, thank you so much for highlighting how Interpol supports the identification and information exchange on suspicious items. I think this is truly the importance of the preventative nature of what we're discussing today. And I think in addition to physical security aspects that you noted, one of the cases you highlighted also the importance of non-physical safeguarding measures, in particular, including knowledge transfers. I think that was something that, I wanted to make sure that I highlight, that I took away, that was interesting to note. Of course, when it came to information exchange, and you noted on two elements that I just want to highlight, one being the regional engagement, where you're sort of facilitating the engagement from a bottom-up approach to strengthen information exchange platform. I thought that was really interesting as an approach. The second element being that you established through engagement with the industry, this advisory community, which can then alert essentially national authorities and Interpol about issues or items that may be suspicious in nature, whether it may be quantity or items themselves. So, these are really innovative, meaningful approaches that you've undertaken, and thank you so much for highlighting them. Colleagues, we have about 15 minutes to now enter into, let's say, a discussion. And so now I would like to invite all speakers that have joined us today, Leonard as well, to join us in the Q&A session. Now, for the attendees, there is a Q&A function that is available to you at the bottom of the Zoom webinar platform. If you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to enter them now, and I'll be sure to try to pick up on them. If we are not able to address some of the questions that you raised, I will be sure to facilitate follow-ups with any relevant stakeholders. But let's maybe first start, colleagues, with the question around identification and monitoring. Maiko-san, we heard a bit about new developments in the type of IEDs that are manufactured. new items that are being integrated, or new means of their delivery. Can you elaborate a little bit more, perhaps, for us, how one could keep up with such a monitoring effort? Maybe we can start with you, Mike, a little bit on reflections, if there are any lessons that you can share, and then we can have brief intervention from Maiko-san. I would ask our colleagues on the panel to be quite brief, if you can, mindful of the time as well. So Mike, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I have two things to say. One is that, as Maiko said, the distinction between IED components and dual-use components for other kinds of weapon systems is decreasing in some contexts. We're seeing attempts to build airborne IEDs and delivery systems that incorporate conventional military components or dual-use components. Therefore, we see attempts by terrorist groups to build software-controlled devices that have complicated processors or semiconductors, these kinds of things. So I absolutely agree that that is happening. And we can't hope to continue to elaborate control lists to catch everything that comes out of an IED constructor's brain. So as Maiko said, we can't necessarily help to control all of these things before export, but that doesn't mean that we can't track them after their export and when they're found, if they are correctly, if the record keeping is right and the marking is right. And in most cases, these are commercial items for whom lot and batch numbering, for example, is not designed for supply chain tracing. It's designed for quality control to catch, a batch that might have a fault that can be recalled. So I think elaborating record keeping and tracing standards in this area is absolutely critical, because we can't rely on pre-export controls.
Thank you so much, Mike. Over to you, Maiko-san, if you have some things to add on that topic, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Mike's answer was so comprehensive. Let me one thing add to that, where to get this information, where to get the particular list of items that is used. UN sanction monitoring panels reports, its annual reports, especially Yemen panel and Somali panel, I would recommend to see. Himayo-san, may I chat to everybody in the links so that you can check? Yeah, okay, thank you. That's all.
Thank you so much, Maiko-san, for also sharing with us reference sources of information that authorities can use. And Mike, very interesting about the limitations, of course, of pre-export risk assessments as well, and the need for post-delivery monitoring in this regard. And this, of course, raises a little bit of capacity type of reflection as well. But let's maybe move now to another question that I have for you. And this one particularly, I would like to ask Leonard. Leo, we heard quite a bit from today's presentation about the importance of a regional approach. We heard that there needs to be more, let's say, systematic information exchange. But from your experience, Leo, what is working well and what is missing in terms of a regional approach so far, from your experience, in terms of addressing the upstream prevention aspects of IEDs? Please, Leo, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think the very first point I will really look at is that even though the various regional, for me, I'll talk about the ECOWAS region has various instruments and on small arms, light weapons, the ammunition. The issue of IEDs seems to be escaping the radar. There seems not to have a regional approach, a regional strategy, a regional framework to deal with issues of IEDs. So that has been a challenge and a gap. So the focus has already been on small arms and light weapons. There has been on some ammunitions, small arms ammunitions, and it looks like the issue of IED is not being tackled. So we need a regional approach, just like we are using in terms of the issues of small arms and light weapons, where we have adopted a regional approach to deal with this. Information sharing seems to be, because most of the information that we get are actually from international partners, and it doesn't look like within ourselves as ECOWAS member states, we are sharing enough information in this regard. And everyone seems to be keeping the information to themselves. If I want any information from what has happened in other countries, I need to sometimes go to CAR or go to Interpol to get that information. Between us, member countries, we seem not to be sharing a lot of information and intelligence in that regard. Obviously, because we don't have a regional framework for sharing on IEDs, information of issues of information sharing is also seems to be not to be in place. So these are the two responses that I have to the question that you have raised. Over.
Thank you, Leo. Very interesting. I reflect on sort of the absence of a regional strategy as on IEDs as one of the areas that particularly could stem out of this type of dialogue where further approaches and efforts can be made on this. Daniel, I would like to maybe tag along to this because, Leo mentioned about the challenges pertaining to information exchange coming out of national authorities at a regional level. That may be related to sensitivities of the information, that may be related to lack of mutual legal, let's say, frameworks, that may be related to other, let's say, capacity factors. But let me ask, fundamentally, you are working on identifying red flags. And this is also taking from the question that has come from the floor. What do you think will enable entities like Interpol to make best use of what you already have in terms of platforms and tools that facilitate prevention? This is something that you mentioned already from the regional engagements approach, but are there others that you would like to maybe re-emphasize or emphasize more? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hima. I think it depends on the country in which we're partnering with. I think the number one thing is we need to better understand what's happening in each country and their domestic needs. There are some countries that don't consolidate IED data at the national level, and so kind of bits of information are held perhaps by customs partners or in a military context or a policing context, and there isn't really a national analysis of what that threat and what those problems are. And that's really going to help us target exactly where our interventions need to go. We try to adapt to that through our regional intelligence sharing working groups, that watchmaker framework. That is an iterative process. So it's not like we go into one country or one region and we get all the information we need overnight. It often takes several months, even years of engagement at a regional level for everybody to understand the characteristics we're looking for, the data we're looking for, the information that's valuable for one another. Because we're also dealing with different jurisdictions, and the type of information they're going to gather from a crime scene or from an investigation is going to be different from country to country. So I mean, these, for us, our national law enforcement partners, it's the same office in every country. That doesn't change, and it's their job to connect us with other partners in country. And that's really an iterative process to help us build out a network at the national and regional level. And those intelligence sharing working groups, it's a good hook to bring partners into a room so that we can help not standardize reporting, but certainly get things in a framework that helps us kind of disseminate information to our member countries.
Thank you, Daniel. And tagging onto this, of course, there is one partner that I want to acknowledge at this time because there was a comment in a Q&A that I think is very relevant. It's from the World Customs Organization. Of course, Interpol works very closely with them on global program Global Shield. But the intervention from our colleague from World Customs Organization is indeed customs plays an crucial role as well in terms of the preventative efforts, in particular in helping to identify suspicious items that may come into a country. And in addition to this, it's noted that since 2010, the program Global Shield has helped to build capacity of national authorities, in particular in customs areas, to be able to identify chemical precursors, to analyze them, to profile them, in order to prevent the manufacturing of IEDs. And so I wanted to also acknowledge this point that has come from the floor, and indeed is an important perspective to keep in mind. Now, mindful of the time, colleagues, we are now approaching the close of this session. So in this regard, I would like to first and foremost thank all the panelists for joining us today. It has been quite an interesting and fascinating exchange of views about what more can be done to contribute towards upstream IED prevention. I'd like to also take this opportunity to express sincere appreciation once again to the government of Japan, in addition to the European Commission and Germany for supporting the work that Conflict Armament Research does on preventing the proliferation of IED material. Last information I want to share with you is that stemming from this dialogue as a first starting point, we will produce a short story that elaborates further on some of the lessons that were identified here, as well as good practices. And this will be made public for others to really reflect on and to join further dialogue on this matter. So with this, I'd like to now thank all participants that have joined us on a Friday afternoon or Friday morning for this event. I'd like to thank Mike, Maiko-san, Leonard, Daniel, thank you so much. And of course, Ambassador Ogasawara, who has provided us with this remark. And with this, on behalf of Conflict Armament Research and together in cooperation with the government of Japan, I thank you so much. And we will close this event at this time. Thank you and have a great weekend. All the best now.